Richard Ashford had forgotten what his daughter's laughter sounded like. Standing in the marble foyer of his Manhattan penthouse at 11:47 p.m., briefcase still in hand, he froze as the unfamiliar melody drifted down from the second floor. For a moment, his heart clenched with a pain so sharp it nearly brought him to his knees. Emma hadn't laughed. Ida hadn't made any sound of joy in the 3 years since the accident that left her paralyzed from the waist down. The sound was ethereal, bubbling up like spring water after a long drought, and it shattered something inside him that had been carefully constructed from guilt, grief, and relentless work schedules. Richard set down his briefcase with trembling hands, his $3,000 suit suddenly feeling like a costume he'd worn too long. The laughter came again, joined by music, something soft and melodic he didn't recognize. His Italian leather shoes whispered against the marble as he climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last. Richard Ashford, who commanded boardrooms and closed million-dollar deals with unwavering confidence, found himself terrified of what he might discover. The music grew clearer as he reached the landing, a gentle waltz playing from Emma's room. The door cracked open just enough to reveal a sliver of warm lamplight. What he saw through that narrow opening would haunt him forever, not with horror, but with the devastating beauty of a moment he'd never imagined possible. Maria Santos, the quiet woman he'd hired 6 months ago to help care for Emma, was kneeling beside his daughter's wheelchair, her work uniform replaced by a simple blue dress. Emma, his beautiful 17-year-old daughter who'd barely spoken since the accident, was radiant with a smile Richard hadn't seen in years. But it was what they were doing that stopped his breath entirely. They were dancing. Maria had positioned herself so that Emma could place her hands on Maria's shoulders, and together they swayed to the gentle three-quarter time. Maria's movements careful and graceful as she helped Emma's upper body flow with the music. Emma's legs, still and silent in her wheelchair, were forgotten in this moment of pure magic. Her face was animated with joy, her eyes sparkling as she whispered something that made Maria laugh, a warm, genuine sound that seemed to unlock something precious in his daughter's expression. Richard pressed himself against the wall, his throat tight with emotions he'd buried under years of corporate armor. When had he last seen Emma smile like that? When had he last taken the time to sit with her, really sit with her, without his phone buzzing or his mind racing through tomorrow's schedule? The accident had been his fault. Not directly. He hadn't been driving the car that hit Emma's taxi that rainy November evening. But he'd been the one who insisted she come to his office Christmas party, the one who'd made her feel obligated to attend because it would look good for the family. She'd been on her way there when the drunk driver ran the red light. The guilt had eaten at him like acid, driving him to work longer hours, take on bigger deals, build higher walls between himself and the daughter who needed him most. In the months that followed, Richard had hired the best doctors, the most expensive therapists, the finest equipment money could buy. He'd thrown everything he had at Emma's recovery except the one thing she'd needed most: him, his presence, his time, his willingness to sit with her in the darkness and just be her father. The music shifted to something slightly more upbeat, and Maria began to spin the wheelchair slowly, Emma's delighted laugh ringing out like church bells. Richard watched as his daughter, his brilliant, beautiful daughter who'd wanted to be a dancer before the accident, threw her head back with pure joy, her dark hair catching the lamplight like silk. "I feel like I'm flying, Maria," Emma whispered, her voice carrying through the crack in the door. "It's been so long since I felt like I was flying." Maria's response was gentle, accented with the warmth of her native Colombia. "Mija, You are flying. You have always been flying. Sometimes we just forget how to feel our wings. Richard's hand flew to his mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. When had Maria learned to speak to Emma like this? When had she discovered the key to unlocking the girl who'd been trapped inside grief and rehabilitation schedules? He thought of all the expensive specialists he'd paraded through their home, all the clinical approaches and measured progress reports, and realized he'd been trying to fix Emma like she was a broken deal instead of loving her like she was his daughter. The dance slowed, and Maria gently guided Emma's wheelchair to face the mirror on the far wall. "Look, Emma," she said softly. "Look how beautiful you are when you let yourself be happy." Emma stared at her reflection, and Richard saw her expression shift from joy to something more compulsive, a recognition of herself that seemed to surprise her. "I'd forgotten," she whispered. "I'd forgotten that I could still be me." "You were never broken, Mija," Maria said, kneeling beside the wheelchair and taking Emma's hands. "Different, maybe, changed, yes, but never broken." "Your papa tilde inverted exclamation mark. He sees you as broken, and so you started to see yourself that way too." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He sagged against the wall, finally understanding the distance he'd created between himself and Emma, not just with his absence, but with his approach to her condition. He'd been so focused on what she'd lost that he'd never celebrated what remained. So focused on fixing her that he'd never simply loved her. "He tries," Emma said quietly. "But when he looks at me, all I see is his guilt, like I'm a constant reminder of his failure." "And what do you see when you look at me?" Maria asked gently. Emma smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "I see someone who sees me, just me. Not my wheelchair, not my limitations, not what I used to be able to do, just me." Richard couldn't bear to listen anymore. He pushed open the door, and both women turned toward him in surprise. Emma's face immediately shuttered, the joy fading as she prepared for his disappointment about staying up late, about the mess in her room, about not following her prescribed routine. But instead of speaking, Richard crossed the room in 3 quick strides and dropped to his knees beside Emma's wheelchair, pulling her into the tightest embrace he'd given her since before the accident. He felt her stiffen in surprise, then gradually relax into his arms. "I'm so sorry, baby girl," he whispered into her hair, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry I forgot how to see you, how to love you just as you are." Emma's arms came around him tentatively, then with growing strength. "Daddy, I've been such a fool," he said, pulling back to look at her face. He really look at it, not searching for signs of progress or improvement, but just drinking in the sight of his daughter. "You're so beautiful, Emma. So perfect exactly as you are. Can you forgive a stubborn old man who forgot how to dance?" Emma's smile was watery but radiant. "Will you dance with us?" Richard looked over at Maria, who had been watching the exchange with tears in her own eyes. "Maria, yeah, you don't need to thank me, say A tilde plus minus or Ashford," she said softly. "Emma, she teaches me as much as I teach her." "I need to thank you for much more than dancing lessons," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave my daughter back to me. You gave me back to myself." The 3 of them spent the next hour in that room, with Richard learning to see his daughter through Maria's eyes, and not as a victim or a patient, but as a young woman full of life and dreams that had simply taken a different shape than anyone had expected. They talked about Emma's interest in adaptive choreography, her desire to maybe teach dance to other kids with disabilities someday, her dreams of writing a book about finding joy after loss. As the evening wound down and Maria prepared to leave, Emma caught her hand. "Will you come back tomorrow? Not for work, but to dance?" Maria smiled. "Mija, I will dance with you whenever you need to remember your wings." After Maria left, Richard sat with Emma in comfortable silence for the first time in 3 years. Finally, his daughter spoke. "You know what I realized tonight, Dad?" "What's that, sweetheart?" "I spent so long mourning the dancer I used to be that I never discovered the dancer I could become." Richard squeezed her hand, understanding flooding through him like warmth. "And I spent so long mourning the father I used to be that I never became the father you needed me to be." "We can start over," Emma said simply. "We can learn to dance together." Richard smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. "I'd like that very much." The next morning, Richard did something he hadn't done in a decade. He called in sick to work. Instead, he spent the day with Emma, really with her, learning about adaptive dance techniques and listening to her dreams. He called the contractor to install a dance floor in the sunroom, researched adaptive dance programs, and most importantly, he learned to see his daughter not as she had been or as he thought she should be, but as she actually was, a remarkable, resilient, and whole. Maria's simple act of dancing with Emma had revealed a profound truth. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone isn't trying to fix them, but simply meeting them exactly where they are and celebrating the beauty of that place. Love, Richard learned, isn't about removing obstacles, it's about learning to dance around them, finding joy in the steps that are possible, and discovering that sometimes the most beautiful dances come from the most unexpected movements. In the weeks that followed, Richard's penthouse filled with a different kind of energy. Emma's laughter became a regular soundtrack, Maria became family rather than just an employee, and Richard discovered that the most successful deal of his life hadn't happened in a boardroom, but in a teenage girl's bedroom at midnight, when he finally learned to see his daughter's wings.